In the middle of a snowstorm in Vermont, a bride in a white dress was running across an empty street, and a man who had once sworn never to save anyone again turned his truck around. The wind howled through rows of bare trees lining the road out of Maple Falls. Snow fell so heavily that the streetlights were nothing more than faint halos, drifting in the white haze. Ethan Carter gripped the wheel of his old Ford Ranger, the wipers sweeping rhythmically across the windshield. The smell of burgers and fries from dinner at Brooks Grill mingled with the worn leather scent of the seats, a smell as familiar as the cabin he rented by the lake. The weather report crackled from the radio, warning of a level 3 snowstorm moving toward the northeast of Vermont. Ethan turned the volume down, not because he didn't care, but because winters in this part of the state had taught him how to manage without reminders. The headlights suddenly swept over a sight that made him tense. On the right shoulder of the road, a woman in a full white wedding dress was walking slowly. The thin lace was crusted with ice crystals, trailing along the wet, freezing pavement. Her brown hair was a tangled mess, damp curls plastered to flushed cheeks. In one hand, she loosely held a pair of ivory heels, her fingers turning purple from the cold. Ethan's first instinct was to keep the wheel straight and keep driving. His eyes stayed ahead, but in his mind echoed a voice he'd heard before his own, from 5 years ago. Don't get involved in anyone's mess again. You tried to save someone, and you failed. An image of Samantha, his little sister, flashed through his mind. Her bright blonde hair, the smile that once lit up an entire room, and then the shadow in her eyes during those last months before she left. Just the thought of it made his chest tighten. The Ford Ranger passed the bride. In the rearview mirror, against the swirling white, her small figure swayed in the wind. A gust hit, and she lifted her arm to shield her face, her body turning slightly as if searching for shelter. But all around was nothing but the blurred road and far-off houses. Ethan repeated the familiar line in his head. Don't get yourself into trouble. His hands on the wheel trembled slightly. Then another thought slid in, clear and insistent. What if that were Sam? He hit the brakes. The truck skidded lightly over a thin layer of ice, squealing before coming to a stop. Ethan drew in a deep breath, turned the wheel, and swung the truck around in the golden wash of the streetlights. When he pulled up beside her, he rolled down the passenger side window. A wave of warm air spilled out, the exact opposite of the skin-biting cold outside. His voice was low and to the point, as he told her she would freeze to death out here and should get in the truck. She looked up. Her gray eyes held not just caution, but a bone-deep exhaustion. Her hair was frozen in places, her shoulders trembling beneath the soaked dress. She rasped that she had nowhere to go. Ethan said that for now, she should get warm, and he would take her somewhere safe. She hesitated for a few seconds, then gave a small nod. As her small hand reached for the handle, he noticed the joints of her fingers were reddened from the cold. The door swung open, letting in a burst of wind that carried a faint trace of jasmine, the lingering scent of a ceremony just abandoned. She closed the door, cradling the heels in her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Ethan said nothing more. He pressed the gas, merging the truck into the swirling snow. Outside, the town faded away behind the white curtain. If you've ever stood at a crossroads, forced to decide to walk away or turn back, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to follow and ring the bell so you won't miss more heart-touching stories from American Stories. Inside the truck, there was only the sound of the wind and the steady hum of the heater. Ethan glanced at her briefly. Under the dim light, the outline of the wedding dress stood out on the seat, speckled with a few ice crystals that hadn't melted yet. She sat upright, her eyes fixed on the night ahead. She quietly said her name was Claire, as if to confirm her own existence. He replied with his Ethan. No more questions. They both kept their eyes on the road ahead, letting the golden glow of Maple Falls fade slowly behind them. Ethan's cabin sat on the edge of town, beside a narrow road that led to Maple Lake. As the truck turned onto the lane, the yellow light from the porch illuminated the fresh tire tracks pressed into the snow. Ethan cut the engine, letting the sound fade until only the wind outside could be heard. He told her to go in first, and said he would find something dry for her to wear. Then he opened his door and stepped out, his boots sinking deep into the thick snow. Claire followed, clutching her heels to her chest. When she crossed the threshold, the warmth from the fireplace wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. The scent of smoldering pine wood mingled with the faint aroma of old coffee. The furnishings were simple. A worn armchair, wooden bookshelves, a desk piled high with files, and dust-covered books on psychology. Ethan disappeared into the bedroom and came back with a gray sweater and an old pair of jeans. He placed them on the chair and explained that they had belonged to his sister, and if she didn't mind, she could wear them for now. Claire gave a slight nod of thanks and stepped into the small bathroom in the corner of the cabin. The sound of running water filled the room for a while before it fell silent. Ethan stood by the fireplace, using an iron poker to stir the logs so they would burn more evenly. A moment later, Claire emerged. Her hair was partly dry, falling loose over her shoulders. The sweater was slightly oversized, the sleeves almost covering her hands, and the jeans reached down to her heels. She no longer looked like a runaway bride, but rather like an unexpected winter guest. Ethan handed her a mug of warm milk, explaining that it was low in sugar and better for her health. She gave a faint smile, the first since he had met her, and accepted it. They sat across from each other by the fire. The flames cast flickering light on the walls, their shadows occasionally crossing. At first, the questions were simple: where she was heading, how long she had been outside, and whether she needed him to call someone. Claire answered briefly, avoiding details, and Ethan didn't press. The pauses between her replies didn't make the air heavy. Instead, they allowed each of them to read the other in ways no direct question could. When she asked why he lived out here, he said he liked the quiet and needed distance from what came before. She asked what kind of things, but he only gave a small smile, said they were matters he didn't want to remember, and quickly shifted the subject. Ethan asked in return why she had been walking through a snowstorm dressed like that, his eyes flicking toward the wedding dress hanging to dry by the fire. Claire was silent for a few seconds, the firelight reflected in her eyes. Before she said she had walked away from a ceremony she couldn't bear more precisely. An arrangement. He didn't ask further. After years as a psychologist, he knew that some stories should only be told when the person is ready. Outside, the wind grew stronger, pressing fresh snow against the window panes. Inside, there was only the soft crackle of the logs and the faint steam rising from their mugs. Claire set her mug down, gazing out the window for a long while, before asking if anyone had ever told him that too much silence could be frightening. Ethan smiled, saying he had heard that before and thought it was true, but he had grown used to it. They talked until the clock on the wall was nearing midnight. It wasn't a loud conversation, but a series of words separated by long pauses, as if both were testing how much trust to place in the other. When Claire began to drift off on the bed, he slept in every night. Ethan fetched another blanket and gently laid it over her shoulders. He stood there for a moment, watching her face in the firelight, then turned away. He settled into the armchair, where he would sleep that night, leaving the bed for her. And somewhere inside him came the feeling that he had just let a stranger step not only into his cabin, but into a locked room in his heart that had been closed for years. The next morning, pale winter light filtered through the thin curtains, casting quiet streaks across the cabin wall. Ethan woke on the sofa, a blanket draped loosely over him. The smell of fried eggs and toasted bread drifted in, pushing away the familiar scent of wood smoke. He stepped into the kitchen and found Claire standing at the counter, her brown hair tied neatly back, a few loose curls brushing her cheeks. The gray sweater and jeans from the night before made her look far more simple and approachable than the image of the soaked bride he had seen the night before. She explained she had found some food in the cupboard and hoped he didn't mind. Ethan said he didn't, but told her she didn't have to cook. Claire gave a small smile, saying she needed to do something instead of just sitting around. When the simple breakfast was set on the table, Ethan poured her a glass of warm milk, reminding her it was low in sugar and better for her health. Claire glanced at him, the faintest blush on her cheeks, as if it had been a long time since anyone had shown her such thoughtful care. After they ate, they walked to the main street. The snow had been cleared just enough to reveal patches of wet stone pavement. Pushing open the door of Brooks' Grill, They were immediately enveloped by warmth and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Tommy Brooks, the owner, looked up from behind the counter, smiling as he asked why Ethan was out so early on a Saturday. Ethan ordered his usual black coffee, and for Claire, a chamomile tea, saying he thought it suited her. Claire glanced at him in mild surprise, perhaps because it had been so long since anyone had paid attention to such small details. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles from Maple Falls, inside the luxurious conference room of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in Manhattan, Jonathan Pierce stood with his back to the wall of glass, gazing down at Fifth Avenue. On the table lay an open file containing printed stills from security cameras. One blurry frame showed Claire leaving the hotel through the service exit, wearing a staff coat and a knit cap pulled low over her hair. Jonathan turned to the next image, a yellow taxi taking her to the interstate bus terminal, followed by a night bus that carried her out of the city, straight toward New England. His voice was low and heavy as he said this was an insult. The room stayed silent. Margaret Whitmore. Claire's mother sat at the head of the table, her lips pressed tight. Jonathan went on, ordering that the press would explode if this wasn't handled immediately, and demanding that she be found and the matter wiped from the media within 48 hours. An assistant nodded and scribbled notes quickly. Jonathan turned, his eyes cold, and instructed them to use every connection, family, friends, anyone, no matter the cost. Back in Maple Falls, the TV in the diner played in the background, pulling Ethan and Claire back to the present. On screen, the morning news showed an image of a bride in a white dress outside the Whitmore Grand, and the headline scrolling below, Runaway Bride, Claire Whitmore, daughter of Whitmore. Luxury resorts disappears. During wedding, Claire froze, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup's handle, before quietly saying she guessed the news was out. A few glances flicked toward them from around the diner before quickly looking away. In a small town like Maple Falls, news didn't need the internet to travel fast. Leaving the diner, Ethan drove down Main Street and pointed to a 2-story white building with a wooden sign hanging from the porch. Willow Creek Inn. He told her the owner, Mrs. Henderson, was a good and discreet woman, and she was always looking for help. Claire looked toward it, a flicker of hope in her eyes, and asked if he could help her inquire. Ethan said he certainly could. The truck turned toward Maple Lake. In the cabin, neither of them spoke, but the air between them felt less like that between strangers. Claire turned toward the window, watching the frozen surface of the lake reflect the silvery gray of the afternoon. Somewhere in her eyes, Ethan saw that she wasn't just running away. She wanted to start over. The next day, he would keep his word and take her to Willow Creek Inn, where she had no idea that what awaited behind that door would alter the course of both their lives. In the morning, the sky over Maple Falls was washed in a pale blue, the weak sunlight filtering through thick clouds. Ethan opened the cabin door, and the cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Claire stood on the porch, holding an empty flower pot, her cheeks flushed pink from the wind. She said she had found some seeds in the shed, and that in New England, it was still possible to grow certain cold, hardy plants this time of year. Ethan folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe, admitting he had let a few potted plants wither away long ago. Claire replied that then they should plant again because no one liked to see something left abandoned forever. They spent the whole morning tending to the small yard in front of the porch. Claire trimmed dead branches and replaced the soil in the old pots. Ethan sawed away rotted planks and repaired the fence. The sound of their voices mingled with the scrape of a shovel breaking soil, the damp smell of earth blending with the fresh scent of pine around the cabin. Ethan noticed how focused Claire was, her hands deft but unafraid of getting dirty. Whenever the wind blew a few strands of brown hair loose from her bun, she would tuck them back behind her ear and return to the plants. In the afternoon, Ethan kept his word and took Claire to Willow Creek Inn. The 2-story inn was painted white, its steep roof a shade of green, sitting just off the main street, with a wide porch lined with wooden rocking chairs. So Mrs. Henderson, the inn's owner, was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired, full-figured, with a warm smile. She greeted Ethan cheerfully and asked after him, then noticed Claire, as Ethan introduced her as a friend looking for work. Mrs. Henderson asked if Claire had ever worked in a hotel, and Claire replied she had managed a resort in California for 2 years. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly and invited them into her office. As they spoke, noise rose from the lobby. A man in a leather jacket strode up to the front desk, his voice raised in irritation as he complained that his room was as cold as a freezer and there was no hot water. The young receptionist looked flustered and unsure how to respond, and Mrs. Henderson was just about to step in when Claire calmly asked if she could try handling it. She approached, keeping her expression steady, and apologized for the inconvenience. She offered to check it right away. The man was still annoyed, but his tone softened slightly at her composed manner. Claire called a maintenance worker to go up to the room with her, discovering that the heating system had been locked due to incorrect settings. She personally adjusted it and tested the unit until warmth spread through the room, then offered him a complimentary breakfast the next morning as an apology. The man nodded, looking satisfied. Miss Henderson watched, then turned to Ethan with an expression both impressed and pleased, remarking that Claire reminded her of herself when she was young, and offered Claire a start date the following week. Claire smiled her thanks. On the way back, Ethan teased that it wasn't bad for a first interview in Maple Falls, and Claire replied she hadn't expected to be hired so quickly. That evening, Ethan cooked a simple meal chicken soup with garlic butter toast. When he set the bowl in front of her, Claire laughed, saying she hadn't imagined he could cook. He said he had lived alone long enough, and if he didn't cook for himself, canned food was all he'd have. They ate in the warm glow of the cabin, while outside, snow fell quietly, covering the yard they had cleared that morning. Ethan shared a few stories about the town, and Claire told a memory from her time in California, the night she had to handle a group of guests arriving late during a storm. For the first time since Sam had left, Ethan laughed out loud, a deep, short, but genuine laugh. Their eyes met across the steam rising from their soup, and they both smiled faintly. Neither spoke it aloud, but something warmer than the fire in the hearth seemed to be taking root between them. The next day, Claire would begin her new job at Willow Creek Inn, but neither of them knew that in just a few days, an unexpected event would put their fragile peace to the test and force them to stand on the same side. The morning at Willow Creek Inn moved at an unhurried pace. The weak winter sunlight streamed through the large window, falling across the front desk, where Claire was jotting down reservations for the coming week. The smell of freshly baked muffins drifted in from the kitchen, mingling with the rich aroma of coffee. Out on the porch, Ethan and Mrs. Henderson were examining a section of the wooden railing warped by ice, the wood creaking as he tested its strength with his hand. Everything was peaceful until an unfamiliar sound reached them, the simultaneous shut-off of car engines out on the street. Ethan looked up and caught sight of 3 black SUVs parked in a perfect line along the curb, their glossy paint reflecting the muted light of the winter morning. No one in town drove vehicles like that. The door of the lead car opened. Jonathan Pierce stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, his gray suit immaculate without a speck of dust. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, his polished leather shoes gleaming so brightly they mirrored the snow beneath them. Behind him, 2 men in dark coats followed, each step measured with the practiced air of bodyguards. Jonathan didn't enter right away. He stood for a few seconds at the foot of the steps, letting his eyes sweep over the porch, as if assessing the worth of every board and every window pane. That gaze wasn't just looking for someone, it carried a silent message of power. Inside, Claire heard the door chime and looked up. When she recognized Jonathan, her heartbeat quickened, but her face held the calm she had mastered over years. Her fingers tightened unconsciously around the pencil on the counter. Jonathan walked in, the bell above the door chiming into the stillness. He stopped in the center of the lobby, just close enough to take in every feature of her face, then told her she had people searching everywhere for her. Claire replied, her voice steady though her eyes were cold, that she didn't need anyone to look for her. Ethan stepped in from the porch, positioning himself slightly between them. Jonathan glanced at him, the corner of his mouth lifting as if he had just spotted an interesting chess piece. He told Claire that she had no idea who this man was, but he did. Jonathan claimed that no help ever came without strings attached, and no one gave anything for free. Claire frowned, but Jonathan didn't stop. He took a step closer, pointing toward Ethan, saying this man hadn't brought her here out of kindness alone. Everyone had a motive. He wanted her to remember that. Ethan stayed where he was, his gaze steady, though his shoulders had tensed. He knew Jonathan was trying to sow doubt and smear him, but any reaction now would only give the man ground. Claire cut in, insisting Jonathan was making baseless assumptions. Still, Jonathan pressed on, saying he only wanted her to be aware, and reminding her that Ethan had a past that wasn't spotless. He asked whether Ethan had told her yet. When Ethan demanded to know what he was implying, Jonathan answered that before coming here. He had hired a private investigation firm and learned Ethan had once been one of Chicago's top psychologists, praised in the press until his sister vanished. In Ethan's mind, images surged and overlapped. His office, the dim light, the hollow eyes of Samantha, but he stood upright, refusing to let Jonathan see the shift inside him. Jonathan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for both of them to hear, saying that if Claire knew everything, she would understand that no one simply appears to save her. Men like Ethan know exactly when to step into her life. Claire drew in a deep breath, forcing her voice not to tremble, and told Jonathan that trying to destroy her trust wouldn't work. Jonathan replied, "We'll see," then straightened, his gaze locking onto hers, and told her to come with him right now. The space between the three of them closed to just a few steps. Jonathan tilted his head, the gel-slicked hair unmoved, even as the cold wind slipped through the crack in the door. He spoke slowly, forcing each word down onto the wooden floor, demanding that Claire go with him right now. Claire stood tall, her shoulders drawn tight like a wire pulled to its limit, and answered firmly that she would not go. A heavy silence fell over the lobby. The tick of the wall clock seemed to stretch unnaturally long, each beat loud and clear. Jonathan gave a half-smile, the kind that never reached his eyes, and asked whether she thought she was stronger here, and if she had forgotten what he had done for her. Claire replied that what Jonathan called done for me was, in truth, done for himself. Her voice was flat but steady as she told him she had felt alone, even standing beside him. Familiar images rushed back into her mind. A cold living room at midnight, phone calls from strange numbers, the door opening to the smell of liquor and unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirt collar. She reminded him of the many times she had asked, only for him to say it was work, and to get angry when she refused to stay silent. Jonathan blinked, his jaw tightening, before saying she knew the nature of his work. Claire answered that his work didn't require affairs, nor did it give him the right to control her every step, forbid her from seeing friends, or demand she report her hours like an employee. She concluded it wasn't love, it was a prison. At the edge of the counter, Miss Henderson quietly set down a cup of tea, then retreated through the side door. She pulled out her phone, calling emergency services, her voice low but firm as she reported that there was a stranger at Willow Creek Inn with bodyguards applying pressure, and requested immediate assistance. Jonathan drew a deep breath, shifting his gaze to Ethan as if looking for an easier target. He sneered that Ethan fancied himself a hero, then emphasized that a man who couldn't save his own sister was hardly going to save anyone else. Ethan didn't respond. His hand tightened briefly before relaxing again. Before he could speak, Claire stepped forward half a pace, standing level with him, and told Jonathan he had no right to speak about that, because Ethan had given her something Jonathan never had, safety and respect. Jonathan raised his eyebrows, as if he couldn't believe Claire was openly siding with Ethan. A thin, mocking smile touched his lips, but his eyes flashed with jealousy. He asked whether Ethan had told her about the accident Sam had witnessed, and why his sister had disappeared. A flicker of surprise crossed Claire's face, not doubt toward Ethan, but shock at hearing a new piece of the puzzle. She turned toward him, but he kept his gaze steady and calm, extinguishing any satisfaction Jonathan might take from the moment. Jonathan flicked his hand as if ending a game, saying that if Claire wouldn't leave the easy way, then they'd do it the other way. His bodyguards immediately shifted, moving quickly across the lobby. One reached out to grab Claire's arm, but she stepped back. Ethan moved in, blocking him, his voice low but firm as steel, saying no one was taking her anywhere. The air thickened, like a sealed room running out of oxygen. The bodyguards glanced toward Jonathan, waiting for the order. At that moment, sirens cut through the tension, red and blue lights flashing through the windows, casting streaks across the white walls and polished floor. Mazda Henderson returned from the side door, standing calmly in the corner. Jonathan narrowed his eyes, calculating. A brawl in a small Vermont inn with the police already outside was too risky. He adjusted his cufflinks, as if drawing a period on the encounter, then told Claire she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Claire met his gaze and replied that her biggest mistake had been staying by his side for too long. Another silence stretched. Jonathan's voice turned cold, as he declared that, from this day forward, her family would receive no financial support from him, and that she wouldn't survive the humiliation. He signaled, and the bodyguard stepped back to clear a path. The door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air tinged with the scent of snow. Jonathan turned his head, lowering his voice so only the three of them could hear, telling her that this time he was letting her go, but next time, there wouldn't be police there to stop him. The door shut. SUV engines roared to life, tires grinding over hard ice before fading into the distance. Outside, the red and blue lights dimmed, as if someone had turned down the brightness of the world itself. Claire stood still for a moment, her hands trembling slightly, her breathing slowed, like someone surfacing after a long dive. Ethan leaned in, keeping a respectful distance but close enough for her to feel she wasn't alone, asking if she was all right. She answered that she was better than ever, but Jonathan would come back. Ethan nodded, saying he knew, and that next time, they wouldn't be alone. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, resting her hand on the counter as if to steady them both, then reminded them the police wanted statements, and she had asked them to wait a few minutes. Claire nodded her thanks. Her eyes caught the mirror on the wall, a woman in a gray sweater, her hair neatly tied back, no longer the bride in a white dress from that snowy night. For a moment, she saw herself again, the manager of a bustling resort, the woman who knew how to handle a crisis, and the one who had just chosen her own freedom. Ethan turned slightly, as if about to say something, then stopped. They both listened to the clock ticking off a few more beats. Outside, the town was returning to its usual rhythm. Inside, the lobby still held the scent of wood and chamomile tea, and a new layer of air, fragile but resilient, born of an alliance just formed. The storm had passed through the door, but its echo lingered in their eyes, like a reminder that the peace in Maple Falls had just cracked. And sometimes, it's through the cracks that something new takes root. The snow outside had stopped falling, but the air inside Willow Creek Inn still carried the chill of the small storm that had just passed. The yellow light pooled on the wooden floor, casting soft, round halos as if trying to soothe everything. Claire sat in a corner of the lobby, holding a cup of chamomile tea gone cold. The police had left. Maso Henderson was busy tidying up, but the sound of Jonathan's SUVs pulling away still seemed to echo in her ears. She knew she had just slammed shut a door, and with it, cut off her family's financial support. The relief of breaking free from him was threaded with a vague unease about the future. Claire had never been good at leaning on others. She hated the feeling of having her life decided by someone else. But this time, the space ahead felt truly wide and cold. Late that night, Ethan returned to the cabin and found Claire sitting at the table near the window. The light from the fireplace cast a warm gold across her hair, a streak of brightness against the white world outside. He didn't ask anything at first, just poured hot water into a teapot, dropping in a few sprigs of dried mint. The gentle fragrance spread, mingling with the scent of burning pine wood. Claire spoke first, her eyes lowered to the cup of tea he had just placed in front of her, saying she couldn't offer her family any financial help, at least not now. Jonathan would keep his word and cut everything off. Ethan sat across from her, elbows resting on the table, and simply nodded. He offered no hollow reassurances, asked no further questions. The fire crackled in the hearth, its red glow reflected in his eyes. Claire took a sip, letting the warmth seep into her chest. but it was the silence itself that made her realize he was thinking of something heavy. Ethan began to talk about Samantha, his sister. He spoke slowly and evenly, as if tracing each step back through memory. Samantha had once been vibrant, full of dreams, but one evening, when she was just 19, she witnessed the accident that took both their parents. After that, she was never the same. Sleepless nights, sudden waves of panic, and Ethan had used everything he knew, not just as a psychologist, but as a brother, to pull her back, but he failed. One winter night, Samantha left home, leaving behind only a short note with the words, "Don't look for me." Ethan never found her. From that day on, he lost faith in himself, in his profession, in everything. He left the city, abandoning status and reputation, to come here, wanting only a quiet place long enough to remake himself. Claire sat in silence, the firelight shifting over his face, tracing lines of weariness that hadn't fully defeated him. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, there was no barrier in his eyes, telling her he had helped her, because he still wanted to believe that somewhere out there, Sam would meet someone willing to do the same. Claire's throat tightened. She knew this wasn't an excuse, it was the simplest truth. She told him he had fought for his sister, and now he was fighting for her. She didn't know how to thank him enough. Ethan gave a faint smile, not quite happy, but lighter, as if some weight had eased. Claire went on, saying she didn't want to rely on him for everything. She wanted to work, to rebuild from nothing, and this time for herself. Ethan was silent for a moment before nodding, saying he would respect that. But when she needed him, he would be there. They stood side by side near the window, watching the snow fall slowly over the footprints left that afternoon, as if repainting an unfinished picture. Inside Ethan, a quiet prayer rose for Sam, for Claire, and for himself, that no matter how long or short the road ahead, there would be at least a stretch they could walk together. A week had passed since the tense afternoon at Willow Creek Inn. Maple Falls still lay under a thick blanket of snow, but the air in town had settled, like a lake, just freed from the grip of a strong wind. Beneath pine branches heavy with snow, winter lights were beginning to be strung up, signaling that the holiday season was near. Claire walked quickly through the main lobby of Willow Creek Inn, holding a list of guest reservations. That morning, a tour group had arrived almost 2 hours earlier than expected. The rooms weren't ready yet, and the reception staff exchanged uneasy glances. Claire smiled, stepped in to take charge, apologized to the guests for the inconvenience, and invited them to enjoy hot chocolate and gingerbread in the tea room while they waited. Within minutes, laughter and the scent of cinnamon from the gingerbread spread through the corner of the room, while the housekeeping staff quickly finished their work. When the keys were handed to the guests with a word of thanks, it was as if the mishap had never happened. From the far end of the lobby, Mrs. Henderson watched Claire with a look of approval, remarking that she had the makings of a manager. Claire only smiled, but felt a quiet warmth inside. That afternoon, Ethan stopped by the town library. It was small but cozy, with the smell of old paper mingling with pine wood and the warm glow of low table lamps. He had begun volunteering there as a part-time counselor a few times a week, mostly for teenagers and others in need of someone to listen. Today, a boy of about 14 sat across from him, his eyes red from crying. His parents had just divorced. He blamed himself for being the cause of their arguments. Ethan didn't lecture him. Instead, he told a story about a small boat weathering a storm. Sometimes the storm wasn't caused by the boat, and the job of those on board was simply to keep their hands steady on the tiller so they wouldn't be sunk. The boy left the library with a lighter step, while Ethan stayed, gazing out at the fine snow falling past the window. The town was alive with preparations for the winter festival. Along Main Street, wreaths of pine hung from doors, strings of lights wrapped around lampposts. Claire and Ethan joined the volunteer group, helping to hang lights around the square. When Claire reached up for a coil of lights, Ethan reached for it. At the same time, their fingers brushed for an instant. They both laughed, pretending it was nothing. But the warmth of that touch stayed with Claire the rest of the afternoon. The scent of cinnamon and hot chocolate from the festival stalls drifted through the air. Christmas music played softly, mingling with the laughter of children running around the tree being set up in the square. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, Claire and Ethan remained on a wooden bench facing the square. In front of them, the massive tree was only half decorated, promising to blaze with color when the festival began. Ethan handed her a cup of hot chocolate, steam curling between them, blurring the space in between. He said that when the festival started, the town would be busier, louder but warmer. When Claire replied that she thought she was starting to like the noise, her eyes reflecting the light from the strings of bulbs. They talked about the stalls that would open, the games for children, and the baked goods Mrs. Henderson would sell. Each story stretched just a little longer, as if to keep the other from leaving. Their eyes met a few times, holding longer than politeness required, but neither spoke the thing that lingered at the threshold. Snow kept falling, laying a thin layer over the bench and the two steaming cups set side by side. In that moment, everything felt briefly at peace. No Jonathan, no shadow, only the sound of snow meeting the ground and something quietly growing in the silence. In Maple Falls, winter had yet to end, but another season had already begun in their hearts. Spring sunlight spread over Willow Creek Inn like a thin golden blanket. The first tulips and daffodils pushed up through the cold earth, showing their colors in the garden that Ethan and Claire had tended together all winter. The breeze carried the scent of flowers mixed with the aroma of Mrs. Henderson's apple pie baking in the kitchen, while the sound of tourists' laughter drifted in from the front yard. Claire stood by the row of flowers, adjusting a newly opened rose vine. Sunlight filtered through strands of her hair, casting warm highlights across her lightly flushed cheeks. From the wooden porch, Ethan paused for a few seconds just to watch. The sight gave him a peace he hadn't felt in a long time, as if they had both belonged here all along. That week, a particular guest had been staying on the second floor, a young woman, quiet, who usually went out at sunrise and returned late. She always wore a hat and dark sunglasses. Claire had caught glimpses of her a few times at the cafe near the lake, but hadn't thought much of it. Strangers came and went often here. Still, the woman's silence and brisk, purposeful steps left a faint impression. This morning marked the opening day of the town's spring festival. The square was alive with lights and flags, the smell of cinnamon and hot chocolate filling the air. Claire was busy guiding guests to the stalls, while Ethan oversaw the children's games area. No one noticed that at the front desk. The quiet young woman was checking out early. She left only a brief message for the receptionist, saying to give this to Ethan because he would know who she was. By noon, as the crowd began to swell in the square, the receptionist found Ethan and handed him a cream-colored envelope with no sender's name. The paper was slightly creased, as if it had been kept in a coat pocket for a long time. Ethan opened it. Inside was a handwritten card, the penmanship so familiar that his heart stalled. "If you ever meet someone who needs an anchor, stay." He drew in a long breath, his fingers unconsciously tracing each letter. Something small slipped out, catching the sunlight, a silver necklace. He recognized it instantly, the one Samantha had worn nearly every day. The gift he had given her for her 16th birthday. All the festival sounds seemed to fade. He looked up, scanning the yard, the laughing groups of people, searching for a familiar figure. But there was no one, only the spring breeze stirring the necklace gently in his hand. Claire came over, her eyes full of concern, and asked what was wrong. Ethan didn't answer right away. The sunlight in his eyes made them glisten in an unfamiliar way. Finally, he smiled warm, but edged with something tight and said, "Sam was here." Claire froze for a moment, then looked down at the necklace in his hand. Before clasping his hand gently with both of hers, they stood there, in the middle of the blooming garden, letting the unspoken words become a bond stronger than any promise. Across the festival, among the crowd and music, a black SUV sat parked. Behind its tinted windows, a man watched, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly before he turned away. The vehicle slipped into the stream of cars leaving town, unnoticed by anyone. The question of whether Jonathan would truly let this go hung in the air like a small cloud in an otherwise clear spring sky. As evening fell, the warm yellow light from Willow Creek Inn spilled out, reflecting off the last patches of snow in the garden's corners. Ethan and Claire stood side by side, quietly watching townspeople and tourists laugh, enjoying pies and hot chocolate. In Ethan's hand, the silver necklace caught the light, glinting like a promise with no end. They didn't know when Samantha might appear, but in this moment in their first spring together, they both understood that one day, when the door opened, they would step through it together. If you followed this story to the very end, you've likely felt the mix of warmth and unanswered mysteries it carries. Samantha, she had been so close, yet for some reason, chose to leave only a trace instead of stepping forward. And Jonathan, will he truly walk away? Or is this just the calm before the storm? We want to hear your thoughts. What do you think will happen next? Will Samantha return? What will Jonathan do? Share your feelings in the comments. Who knows? Your ideas might inspire the next chapter. And if you want to keep following stories like this, tales that touch the heart and make you think, don't forget to follow the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any ending or beginning. Share this video with someone you think would feel every moment, every breath of the story. Because sometimes the right story at the right time can change an entire day or even an entire life.